Odysseus stands at the edge of the stream of ocean, with the fog already behind him, and the sea already behind him, and the salt smell of the open water already beginning to leave the air around him. He has sailed west from the island of the witch Circe, past the point where the sea lanes end and the charts simply stop, and what he has come to is not a coastline in any ordinary sense, but a shore that exists specifically to be the last shore, the one that adjoins everything that comes after living. The poplars are behind him now, tall and pale in the mist, and the willows behind those, and the fog has closed over them like a cloth settled over a table, and what lies ahead of him is not darkness, exactly, but something more precise than darkness, a world that has withdrawn all the qualities that the living world uses to announce itself. No warmth from a sky he cannot see, no wind, no sound of insects or birds, or water moving over stone. The world ahead of him gives no light, and the world behind him for a moment seems very far. This is where the Greek tradition places its entrance. Not a gate, not a door, not a guarded threshold of the kind that appears in other traditions, the weighing of hearts, the challenge of demons, the bridge across the abyss. The Greek underworld begins in absence. It begins with the subtraction of light and warmth and the smell of salt, so that what remains when all of that has been removed is the country of the dead, occupying the space that ordinary existence had vacated. Homer describes this shore in the Odyssey, the great epic that carries Odysseus from Troy back toward Ithaca and stops him here at the edge of the living world before it returns him home. And what the tradition holds in that description is not terror and not grandeur, but something more difficult to name, a very precise geography, a world whose rules are already in place and have been in place for as long as the dead have needed somewhere to go. The Greek underworld, as the tradition came to describe it across its oldest sources, Homer, Hesiod, Plato, and later Virgil, is not a single chamber, but a landscape, layered and internally differentiated, with its own rivers and its own distances and its own quality of light. The geography matters. It has always mattered in the Greek telling, because the condition of the dead is not an abstraction, but a location, a place one arrives at and inhabits, through which one moves or does not move, in which one stands on ground and perceives, however dimly, the features of the world around. To understand the Asphodel Meadows, the wide, gray, default country where the majority of human souls in the Greek tradition were understood to end up, it is necessary to move through the landscape that surrounds them first, to feel the distances, to cross the rivers in the order they were meant to be crossed, and to understand what each one was for. The rivers of the Greek underworld are 5 in number. Plato, in the Phaedo, provides the most systematic account of them, arranging them into a coherent geography with the philosophical care of someone who understood that the world of the dead needed to be as legible as the world of the living. The Acheron comes first, the river of woe, or in some accounts, simply the river of crossing, the one that bears souls from the world above to the world below. In most versions of the tradition, it is across the Acheron that the ferryman Charon conveys the newly dead, and it is the Acheron's far bank that serves as the effective border between the living world and everything the dead world contains. The Acheron is not violent or dramatic. It is simply wide and still, and the necessary crossing, the last water between one condition and the next. In the tradition's imagining, it flows dark and slow, without urgency, the way very old rivers flow when they have been flowing in the same direction for long enough that haste has become beside the point. The Lethe runs farther in, deeper in the underworld's interior, and its function is not crossing, but erasing. Lethe in Greek means concealment or oblivion, the word buried in the root of the English aletheia, truth, which is literally the unhidden, the unforgotten thing. To drink from the Lethe was to surrender everything that drinking from any other river would leave intact: the face of a father, the particular quality of light in a familiar room on a winter afternoon, the name one had been called since childhood, the texture of grief for someone lost, the weight of joy remembered. All of it went into the water. All of it was carried off by a current that had no particular destination because it carried nothing forward, only away. Souls bound for the Asphodel Meadows in the standard account drank from the Lethe, and what they retained afterward was existence without memory, presence without content, the persistent fact of being without the accumulated weight of having been anyone in particular. This is among the quietest and most precise of the Greek underworld's many precise ideas, that what makes a person is not the soul substance alone, but the specific history woven through it, and that this history can be separated from the soul as cleanly as sediment settles from water, leaving the water clear and without character. The phlegethon runs differently from both of these. Its name derives from the Greek verb phlego, to burn, and what flows in it is not water but fire, or something that flows the way fire would if fire were a river and a river were in permanent motion along a fixed course through a fixed landscape. Plato describes it as running through the underworld along the border of Tartarus, the deep punitive zone below the meadows, where the worst of the dead were sent in the tradition's geography. The phlegethon is not close to the Asphodel Meadows. It is distant, far below, at the edge of the deepest region, and what it provides to the underworld as a whole is not heat, but a kind of light, a wavering orange-red glow, visible at the very limit of perception from the wide plain of the meadows, not warmth, not comfort, but simply the distant indication that something burns at the far edge of a very large dark. The tradition is not specific about what exactly the phlegethon's fire does at the walls of Tartarus, and the sources that mention it move on quickly, as though the burning river is simply a feature of the landscape, the way a particular mountain range is a feature of a particular landscape, present, identifiable, not requiring elaboration. From the Asphodel Meadows, if the shades there could look far enough, the phlegethon would appear as that remote orange wavering, steady and entirely without warmth, at the uttermost bottom of the world. The Cocytus, the river of wailing, or in some accounts of lamentation, is described in the tradition as a tributary of the Styx, the fifth and most significant of the 5 rivers, and flows through the underworld along its own course, with its own function in the geography of the dead. The Cocytus carried particular associations with the mourning of souls, not yet properly buried, those who had died without the rites that allowed the living to release the dead formally into the world below, and who therefore drifted at the borders of the underworld, unable to cross, unable to return, in a prolonged in-between condition that the tradition treated as one of the particular misfortunes that could befall the newly dead. The Cocytus runs cold and dark through accounts that mention it, and its name sounds the way its water presumably sounded to the tradition's imagining, a long, carrying sound that implies distance and persistence. The Styx is last and largest and most significant, and it belongs to a different category of mythological significance than the other 4. The Acheron transports, the Lethe erases, the phlegethon burns, the Cocytus carries lamentation. The Styx is not primarily a functional river, but an ontological one. The border itself, the black water that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead in the most absolute sense the tradition could articulate. Hesiod describes the Styx in the Theogony, his great systematization of Greek myth, which dates to roughly the 8th century BCE and represents one of the oldest sustained attempts to arrange the Greek pantheon and its history into a coherent account. In the Theogony, the Styx is not merely a river, but a power, a daughter of ocean and Tethys, an elemental force whose water is so cold, so black, so fundamentally other than ordinary water, that it cannot be contained in any vessel made by mortal hands. The tradition holds that iron will shatter under the Styx's cold, that only the hoof of a horse, a hollow of natural horn, can hold it without breaking. The water is not described as dangerous in the sense of being venomous or corrosive, but simply as being entirely beyond the capacity of human-made materials to contain, the way an idea can sometimes be entirely beyond a particular language's capacity to express, not because the idea is impossible, but because the materials are wrong. What makes the Styx structurally extraordinary in the Greek mythological system is its extension from the geography of the dead into the governance of the divine. The gods of Olympus swore their most sacred and inviolable oaths by the Styx, not by Zeus, not by any principle of justice or truth or honor in the abstract, but by that specific black water flowing through the underworld at the very boundary between living and dead. Hesiod specifies the consequence of oath-breaking with unusual precision. Any god who swore by the Styx, and swore falsely, was punished with 9 years of enforced exile from Olympus, deprived of nectar and ambrosia, unable to attend the councils of the gods, cut off from every function and pleasure of divine community, and then a further year of enforced silence, neither speaking nor being spoken to, before being restored to the company of Olympus. 9 years and 1. The punishment for the greatest possible divine transgression was not death, because gods do not die. It was exclusion. It was removal from the particular community that divinity required. The Styx was the instrument of that enforcement, because the Styx occupied the absolute border of existence. To swear by the river that separated living from dead was to invoke the most final boundary the tradition could name. The river curves around the underworld 9 times in the account that reaches us through the ancient sources, 9 circuits, 9 complete spirals around the entire country of the dead, before the Styx completes itself, or continues. The sources are not entirely clear whether the 9 circuits are a closed count or a continuing motion, and the tradition's imprecision here is perhaps not incidental. The black water going around 9 times in the dark, cold enough to shatter iron, still enough to reflect nothing, carrying the weight of every oath the gods had ever sworn on its surface. From a distance, the Styx cannot be heard. In the tradition's imagining, it is simply present, a dark curve at the edge of perception, a border visible as a quality of absence rather than as a physical feature. Between these rivers, between the Acheron at the entrance and the Styx at the great encircling boundary, and the Lethe deeper in, and the Phlegethon burning distantly along the edge of Tartarus below, the underworld arranges itself into its 3 primary regions. Tartarus is the deepest, lying far beneath everything else, described by Hesiod in the Theogony with a specificity of distance that the tradition clearly found important. An anvil dropped from the surface of the earth, a solid iron anvil of the kind a working smith would use, heavy, unambiguous, would fall for 9 full days and 9 full nights before striking the floor of Tartarus. 9 days. The number is the same as the 9 circuits of the Styx and the 9 years of divine punishment for oath-breaking, and the repetition is characteristic of how archaic Greek myth encodes significance through structural echo rather than explicit statement. What matters about 9 days of falling is not the number, but the distance it implies, a vertical space so enormous that it constitutes its own geography, a fall long enough to be its own kind of journey, through darkness so complete and so sustained that the anvil would strike the floor of Tartarus, having passed through more darkness than any living thing ever perceives. Tartarus is where the tradition placed its punished, the exceptionally wicked, those who had committed outrages against the gods, the figures whose crimes were so large that the Asphodel Meadows were not a sufficient response to what they had done. It is where Sisyphus was sent with his boulder, and Tantalus with his pool that receded, and Ixion on his spinning wheel. But Tartarus, in the tradition's architecture, is far below. It is down at the floor of things, separated from the Asphodel Meadows by the kind of distance that Hesiod's falling anvil makes felt, an enormous, slow 9-day remove. The tradition does not place the ordinary dead near Tartarus. The Tartarus dwell above it, in the wide middle country that begins where the sound of the underworld's rivers fades behind the newly arrived shade, and the plain opens ahead. Elysium, the Elysian fields, the islands of the blessed, described variously across the sources as a place of perpetual gentle weather and flowering meadows and ongoing existence without the flattening effect of the league, is where the tradition placed its most virtuous. Homer places Elysium at the western edge of the world in the Odyssey, reached by the western wind, a place of warmth and ease at the border of the living world, rather than deep in the dead one. In later sources, including Plato, Elysium is described as an internal region of the underworld itself, positioned to one side of the Asphodel Meadows, as Tartarus is positioned below them. Elysium is also small in the tradition's imagining, or at least it is rare. The vast majority of human souls, who had lived lives that were not extraordinary enough for Elysium and not terrible enough for Tartarus, went neither down to the one nor across to the other. They went to the meadows. The Asphodel Meadows occupy the largest zone of the underworld, the wide, gray, flat central country that is not a reward and not a punishment, but simply the default, the place that the tradition held most dead would find themselves when the crossing was complete and the weighing, in whatever form the tradition described it, was done. Homer mentions them. Plato catalogues them in several dialogues. Virgil places them in his Aeneid as the place where Aeneas passes through on his own descent into the underworld, and the quality Virgil gives them, wide, gray, full of the aimless movement of souls whose individual histories have been blurred into collective drift, is consistent with what the earlier sources hold. The Asphodel Meadows are not a place of suffering. They are not a place of reward. They are where the great majority of the dead simply persist, in a condition defined more by what is absent than by what is present, without the pain of punishment, without the warmth of Elysian ease, without the sharp edge of particular individual memory, without much that would distinguish one gray afternoon in the meadows from another. The Cimmerians live at the edge of this world, or rather at the edge of the entrance to it. Homer places them in the Odyssey, on the far bank of the stream of ocean, in a land wrapped permanently in fog and cloud, where the sun never rises, not even in summer, not even at midsummer, when the sun crests highest in the living world. The Cimmerians are not dead. They are a mortal people, or a people that Homer treats as existing at the very margin of the mortal world, inhabiting the permanent gray half-light that the fog-wrapped shore at the edge of ocean provides. They are not in distress in Homer's description. They simply live there, in the mist, going about whatever their lives consist of, in a light that never fully resolves into either day or night. The quality of light on the Cimmerian shore, gray, diffuse, neither the warm clarity of midday sun nor the full black of deep night, is the same quality of light that the underworld itself seems to carry, as though the dead world has its own equivalent of illumination, not bright enough to cast shadows, not dark enough to require any other source of light. Odysseus stands at the shore with this fog around him, and the world behind him, the sea, the sky, the salt smell, the sound of water moving under a hull, already at a distance, already belonging to a condition he has temporarily left behind. He has the blood of the black ram. He has the trench he has dug. He has the libations he has poured in. The sequence that Circe, the witch of the island of Aea, instructed him to pour. And beyond the fog and the poplars and the willows, the underworld is arranged as it has always been arranged, with its 5 rivers and its 3 regions, and the enormous quiet distance between Tartarus at the bottom of everything and the Asphodel Meadows in the middle, waiting with the kind of patience that belongs to things that have been waiting since long before this particular living man arrived at this particular shore, and will continue waiting long after he has sailed back across the ocean and returned to the world of the living. The entrance to the underworld is not marked in the tradition with a specific gate or guarded threshold, though other versions and other moments in the tradition produce different features. What Homer's underworld opens with is simply the cessation of the qualities the living world carried. The fog does not lift as Odysseus moves forward. The light does not increase. The sound of ocean, which has been the constant background of weeks of sailing, fades behind him, and what replaces it is not silence, exactly, but something that has the texture of silence, a quiet so complete and so consistent that the absence of sound becomes its own ambient register, the way a very large room makes itself felt through the quality of the air in it, even when no one is speaking. The Styx curves somewhere ahead, 9 times around the whole of the underworld, its black water holding every oath the gods have ever sworn upon it, without releasing any of them, cold enough to shatter the vessel that a mortal hand could make. Beyond the Styx, the Acheron runs toward its far bank, where the shades wait. Beyond those, the Lethe moves in the interior dark, carrying whatever it carries away from the souls that drink from it. And far below, at a distance that the tradition measures in the falling time of an iron anvil, 9 days, 9 nights, through darkness that has no feature and no bottom until suddenly it has a bottom. The Phlegethon runs its fire along the walls of Tartarus, its glow visible as a faint, distant, wavering orange at the absolute edge of the underworld's interior, a light that provides nothing resembling warmth, but that has been there, in the tradition's imagining, since the underworld itself was arranged, and the rivers were set in their courses, and the regions were distributed through the landscape, according to the logic that the tradition's oldest sources preserve. And the Asphodel Meadows lie ahead, past the rivers and the entranceway, and the Cimmerian shore, with its permanent gray half-light. What opens in that direction, in the tradition's imagining, is a plain, flat, wide, without visible boundary or particular feature, stretching in every direction without the kind of horizon that a living landscape provides. The sound of the rivers fades behind. The wavering orange of the Phlegethon is so far below that it is barely a quality of the air, rather than a visible thing. What the meadows hold is gray-green and wide and entirely quietly still, and the souls of the dead, who were neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally bad, who had lived out their years in the ordinary proportion of kindness and failing and unremarkable passage that most lives consist of, are there already, moving through the gray-green plain in their slow, habitual individualist drift. They have been there. Most of the dead have always ended up somewhere very much like this. The wide middle country, the great default zone of the Greek afterlife, neither rewarded nor punished, simply present in the largest, quietest, most populated region of the entire world below the world. The plain extends without wall or cliff or boundary. The meadows reach their gray-green arms toward every distance at once. And somewhere in the middle of all that still, wide gray expanse, neither arriving nor departing, simply persisting in the way that the tradition understood most souls to persist. The dead go about whatever it is the dead do, in a place defined above all by its enormous, unhurried permanent quiet. On a hillside above the sea, in the light of late spring, the asphodel stands at eye level. The stalks are taller than expected, taller than a person standing among them, in many cases rising to 2 meters or more in dense pale columns from the rocky ground below. Each stalk carries at its crown a cluster of flowers, and the flowers are white, or nearly white, a soft star shape with 6 narrow petals that catch the Mediterranean light and hold it for a moment before releasing it again as the wind moves through. Standing among them, on the gray limestone ground of a hillside that slopes down toward the sea, the stalks press close enough that their flowers brush against the shoulders and face of anyone moving through them. The air smells of stone and salt and something faintly green. Below, the scrubland drops away toward a shoreline. Above, the hillside continues into bare rock. And here, at the center of the slope, the asphodel grows thick and unmistakable, its pale crowns moving together in slow agreement when the wind picks up, the whole hillside appearing, for a moment, gently restless. The flowers themselves are worth looking at closely. From a distance, the whole plant presents as white, a white that is slightly cooler than true white, slightly greener, the white of something that grows in full sun but does not absorb it. Up close, however, each petal carries along its center a stripe, faint but distinct, running from the base of the petal toward its tip, brownish pink in color, a warm tone against the white around it. The stripe is narrow enough that it disappears at any distance, but in the hand, with the flower turned toward the light, it gives each bloom a faint warmth at its heart that the flower does not advertise. Most people walking past a hillside covered in asphodel see only white. The stripe, like many things, requires a closer kind of attention. The species most common across the ancient Greek landscape was Asphodelus, a stivus, sometimes grouped together with the closely related Asphodelus albus, the white Asphodelus of the higher slopes, both belonging to the genus Asphodelus within the family Asphodelaceae, a grouping of plants distributed broadly across the rocky scrublands and dry hillsides of the Mediterranean world. Neither species is delicate. Neither species requires rich soil or regular rain or the kind of cultivated attention that olive trees and grain fields demand from the people who grow them. The asphodel asks very little of its ground and gives back, in return, an annual flowering that comes without invitation, without effort, and without any particular concern for who is watching. It is precisely this quality of self-sufficiency, of a plant that grows where other plants have given up, that gave it so much of its meaning in the ancient world. A hillside covered in asphodel is in a sense a hillside that has been used hard. The plant thrives on ground that sheep and goats have already worked over, cropping everything softer and more palatable down to bare soil and leaving the asphodel untouched behind them. Goats do not eat asphodel. Sheep do not eat asphodel. The plant holds something in its tissues, a bitterness, a quality of fiber that grazing animals consistently decline, and so in any field or hillside that has been grazed heavily, the asphodel persists while everything around it disappears. It spreads across cropped ground the way water spreads across a flat surface, occupying every gap that grazing has opened. Its tall stalks, the last vertical things standing in a field where every other plant has been taken to the root. The Romans called it asphodelus. The Greeks called it asphodelos. In either case, what they were naming was a plant they knew well, not from cultivation, but from recognition. The asphodel was the plant that appeared when the cultivation had failed. Below the ground, invisible from the surface, the asphodel keeps the greater part of itself hidden. The root system is a dense cluster of starchy tubers, pale, firm, swollen underground storage structures that the plant uses to survive drought and poor soil and the kind of thin, rocky ground that would exhaust a less resourceful species. These tubers are substantial. They are dense enough in the hand to have weight to them, pale-fleshed when cut open, starchy in the way that root vegetables are starchy, not sweet, not bitter in the flesh, simply neutral and filling, and entirely without the qualities that make food pleasurable. Ancient Greek writers knew these roots. They knew them not as an interesting botanical feature, but as a food source, specifically as a food source used when the grain ran out. There is a passage in Hesiod's Works and Days that frames the eating of asphodel roots not as a choice a person makes, but as a condition that falls upon them. Hesiod is describing the Iron Age, the last and most diminished of the mythological ages, the one in which human beings find themselves at the time of his writing, and among the features he lists of this degenerate time is the fact that men in such an age are reduced to eating asphodel. The phrasing matters. Hesiod does not say that asphodel roots are poisonous, or terrible, or even particularly unpleasant. He says that eating them is a mark of fallen condition, that eating asphodel is what happens to a person when the better options are gone. In the cultural imagination that Works and Days helped to shape, asphodel eating carried something like the weight of stripped circumstance, not the bottom of things, but far below where a person would choose to be. The plant was adequate. It was available. It did not nourish in any way that felt like nourishment. In a lean year, someone would dig the tubers from the hillside in the dry season when the flowering stalks had browned and fallen and the plant's energy had retreated back underground. The tubers came up in clusters, fist-sized or smaller, clinging together in the rocky soil. Boiled in water in a clay pot over a low fire, they softened enough to be eaten, dense and starchy, and by most accounts not actively offensive in flavor, simply neutral, the kind of meal that fills the stomach without engaging anything else. The smell of them boiling in a small room would have been faintly vegetable, faintly earthy, not unpleasant, but not good either. The meal they produced was adequate, enough to continue on. It is a particular quality of adequacy, the quality of sustenance that makes no promises about what comes next, that simply maintains the minimum condition of continuing to exist. The asphodel was what you ate when existing was the only goal available. This quality of bare sufficiency, of the minimum condition, of sustaining existence at its most stripped and undifferentiated, carried the plant directly into the mythology of the dead. The Greeks who named the great plain of the underworld after the asphodel were not choosing the flower for its beauty, though the flower is, in its own way, genuinely beautiful. They were choosing it for everything else the plant carried with it, the quality of the barely adequate, the sustenance that maintains without nourishing, the persistence on ground too poor and too bare to support anything more demanding. The Asphodel Meadows, as the tradition imagined them, were not a place of punishment. They were not Tartarus, where genuine suffering was the condition. They were instead the vast middle ground, the place where most souls ended up, the gray default of the underworld, maintained at precisely the level of bare spiritual sufficiency that the plant's name had always implied. Not good, not bad, simply continuing. The naming is almost entirely accurate. Think for a moment about what it means for a culture to reach for a plant as the central image of its afterlife for the majority of the dead. Not flowers that were considered beautiful, not the rose, not the violet, not the crocus of spring festivals. Not a plant associated with pleasure or abundance or the god's particular favor. The asphodel, the plant that grew on the hillsides when the better plants were gone, the plant that fed the poor, the plant that goats refused. The choice is so precise and so quietly honest that it seems worth sitting with. The Greeks were not imagining the afterlife of the majority as a paradise withheld from the undeserving. They were imagining it as a condition very much like the condition the plant itself described, persistent, undifferentiated, adequate, and without any particular reason to be otherwise. Across the scrublands of ancient Greece and the wider Mediterranean world, a person walking in the dry spring heat through rocky hillside country would encounter asphodel frequently. It was not a rare plant. It was not a plant that required a dedicated pilgrimage to find or a specialist knowledge to identify. It grew on the hillsides above the villages, on the rough ground between cultivated fields, on the slopes too thin and too stony for anything a farmer might want to plant. It grew at roadsides and on abandoned ground and along the margins of places. Anyone who had spent time in the Greek countryside in spring would know it by sight, would know the height of the stalks, the particular whiteness of the flowers, the way the whole stand moved together when the wind came up the slope. It was background. It was the thing that was always already there on the rocky ground at the edge of the useful world, and it was planted at graves. This is the detail that draws the plant fully into its mythological territory, and it is a detail recorded clearly enough across ancient sources to be taken as a genuine practice, rather than an occasional coincidence. Ancient Greeks planted asphodel on and around grave sites, on hillside burials, around tomb enclosures, along the margins of the ground where the dead were laid. The reasons given in the ancient sources connect directly to the plant's root system. The large, starchy tubers underground could, in the imagining of the tradition, serve as sustenance for the dead in their subterranean realm. The roots reach down through the soil into the earth where the dead lie. The plant, going about its annual growth, serves as both a marker above the ground and a kind of provision below it, living asphodel anchoring the grave to the visible world through its flowering stalks, while its roots press downward through the dark soil toward whatever lies beneath. A hillside grave outside a Greek village, properly tended, would have been marked by the living plant in this way, asphodel flowering directly above the burial, white clusters opening each spring in the particular light of the Greek late spring, their brownish-pink central stripes visible to anyone who stopped to look closely. The wind would move the flowers slowly. The roots, invisible below, would be pressing into the dark soil of the grave. It is a quiet image, and it carries something in it that is neither alarming nor sentimental, simply the fact of a plant going about its annual business at the place where a person was buried, flowering above and reaching below, doing simultaneously the work of the living world and the work of whatever the living world imagined lay beneath it. The asphodel's flowering in the spring would have been one of the reliable seasonal markers of the Greek year, one of the things that happened at a particular time, in a particular light, on the hillsides above the places where people lived. Children growing up near hillside grave sites would have known the asphodel as the plant that grew on the graves. Adults walking past would have registered it, without necessarily thinking, the association woven into the plant's appearance so thoroughly that seeing asphodel in flower and thinking of the dead might have required no conscious connection at all. The way that a particular smell or a particular quality of light can carry a meaning that was placed in it so long ago that its placement is no longer remembered as something that happened, but simply as something that is. In a sense, the asphodel was doing two things at once across the entire length of the Greek countryside in spring. It was flowering on the hillsides where it grew, because the conditions were right for it to flower, and it was marking the graves of the dead and connecting the upper world to the lower world through its root system, and providing the mythological landscape of the underworld with its central image, and doing all of this simultaneously without any awareness of its own significance, without the slightest modification of its growth pattern, without the kind of intention that would make these meanings feel like anything other than projection. The meanings were projected onto the plant by the people who lived near it and thought about death in its presence. The plant simply grew. This division of labor between the plant doing what plants do and the humans finding in that behavior all the meaning that their cosmology required is not a failure of the mythology. It is how mythology works, and the asphodel is a particularly clear example of it working this way, because the plant's actual qualities map so cleanly onto the mythological qualities the tradition assigned to it that the mapping feels almost inevitable in retrospect. The tall stalks rising from rocky ground on the bare hillside above the olive groves, the white flowers catching the spring light, the roots pressing into dark soil below the flowering above, the adequacy of the tubers as food in a lean season, not sustenance exactly, but maintenance, the plant that persists on ground where better things have failed, the plant that grazing animals pass over, the plant that marks the graves with its annual flowering and offers its roots to the dead below the earth. All of these qualities are simply features of Asphodelus going about its life on the limestone slopes of the ancient Greek world. All of these qualities were gathered by the Greek tradition into the name of the gray, wide, quietly sufficient middle ground where most souls came to rest. The fit between the plant and the place it named is so close that the word asphodela carries both meanings simultaneously. Now, without any effort of translation, the plant and the place both described by the same word, both carrying the same quality of pale, persistent, quietly adequate existence at the threshold of something more demanding. The plant that grows on the hillside in late spring is still the same plant. The stalks are still tall, still white flowering, still moving together in slow agreement when the wind comes up the slope from the sea below. The stripe on each petal is still there for anyone who stops to look closely. The faint brownish pink warmth running along each petal's center that disappears at any distance but is fully present up close, in the hand, in the light. The roots are still pressing downward through the rocky soil below, where the thin limestone ground holds whatever it holds, dark and dense, and further down than the flowering above might suggest. The tubers are still starchy and pale-fleshed and adequate. The goats still will not eat them. The plant still spreads across overgrazed ground, occupying the gaps that more desirable vegetation has vacated, standing tall above the cropped and exhausted earth around it, its stalks the last vertical thing left in a field that has been used hard. All of this is simply what the plant does. It has been doing it for longer than the names that were given to it. In Greek, in Latin, in every language that passed through the Mediterranean world and encountered the plant on a hillside in spring and found it necessary to name. Hesiod knew it. Homer knew it. The Greek farmer walking past a hillside grave in April knew it. The poor family boiling asphodel tubers in a clay pot over a lean year fire knew it. They knew it the way people know the things that are always there, on the margins of the productive world, persisting without effort in the places where effort has been exhausted. The mythology grew from that knowledge, not invented as an abstract poetic gesture, but grown from the actual qualities of a real plant on a real hillside, the way that much mythology grows, from the things that people notice about the world and cannot stop noticing, from the things that are always there when they look, from the persistent, unremarkable presence of something that keeps growing on the rocky ground above the graves and flowering white in the spring light, regardless of what the season before it held. There is something in that persistence that the tradition understood and encoded. The Asphodel Meadows were not imagined as a beautiful destination or a punishing one. They were imagined as the place where the majority of the dead simply continued, not transformed, not rewarded, not condemned, simply present in the gray-green plain, as the asphodel is present on the hillside, growing from ground too thin and too used to support more ambitious vegetation, flowering annually in its pale clusters without any particular agenda, its roots pressed into the dark earth below, adequate to the conditions it finds itself in, persistent without being spectacular, sufficient without being generous. The Greek countryside in spring is scattered with hillside graves marked by asphodel in exactly this way, or it was in the centuries when the practice was current, and the evidence of the practice has carried forward through the sources far enough that the image remains legible now. White flowers above the graves, roots below, the plant going about its seasonal cycle with no awareness of the weight that the living have placed on its flowering, the graves quiet beneath it, the hillside continuing down toward the sea, and the sea catching the late spring light, and the asphodel stalks moving together in the wind, and the brownish pink stripe on each petal there, for anyone who wants to look closely, precise and particular, and present in the hand. The plant grows where the cultivation runs out, and where the grazing has stripped the ground, and on the margins of the places where the living go about, the demanding work of staying alive in the ordinary world. It grows above the dead, it feeds the poor, it persists, it flowers white each spring in the thin soil of the hillside, and the stripe on each petal is there, warm against the white, visible only up close, a small and unremarkable specificity at the heart of a flower that appears, from any distance at all, to be entirely plain. That is the plant that the Greeks named their afterlife for. Not the rose, not the lotus, not any flower that the tradition associated with divine pleasure, or heroic achievement, or the particular favor of the gods. The asphodel, the plant of bare sufficiency, the plant that marks the graves, the plant that blooms above where the dead lie and sends its roots down to where they are. A living hinge growing on the boundary between the world that flowers and the world below it, doing its work every spring without instruction, its white star flowers opening in the Greek light above the dark soil where the roots press down, and the ground giving nothing back and requiring nothing, and the plant continuing anyway, adequate and persistent and already flowering before anyone arrives to give it a name. A shade arrives in the Asphodel Meadows, not with any particular entrance, not through any gate that closes behind it, or any threshold it can name. It simply finds itself there. The gray-green plain opens in every direction without boundary or feature, and the shade is standing on it, and the sound of water, the river it has crossed, or the river it has passed, or some river it cannot now identify, is fading behind it at a distance it cannot precisely measure. The ground underfoot is firm. It is neither warm nor cold. The light that falls across the plain is not sunlight and does not come from any visible source, and it neither brightens nor dims, and it is sufficient to see by without being the kind of light that illuminates. Other shades drift at a distance, moving slowly or standing still. The plain is wide. The shade looks at its hands. They are there. They are recognizable as hands, but they hold nothing and can hold nothing, and the shade already knows this, in the way that the newly arrived know things without being told by the particular quality of what is absent in the air around them, by the way no breath moves through whatever now serves as a body, by the understanding that the shades moving in the middle distance are not walking toward anything they intend to reach. This is the beginning of the Asphodel Meadows, as the Greek mythological tradition describes it. Not a catastrophe, not an arrival that anyone witnesses or marks. Simply, the shade is there, and the plain is wide, and the light does not change. In the framework, the oldest Greek sources construct across Homer and Plato and Pindar. The meadows receive the vast majority of the dead. This was not designed as punishment. The tradition does not frame it that way, and it is worth being precise about this, because the impulse to read the meadows as a mild form of purgatory, a place of quiet penalty for lives lived without distinction, misreads what the sources actually describe. The meadows were the destination of the moral middle. The people who had lived neither with exceptional virtue nor with exceptional wickedness, who had been kind in ordinary circumstances and unkind in others, who had worked and eaten and loved and failed in the ratios that most human lives achieve, and who had, in consequence, earned neither the reward of Elysium nor the punishment that belonged to Tartarus. They had lived as most people live, and so they arrived where most people arrive. The meadows were not a lesser Elysium. They were simply the place where the dead went when their lives did not tip the balance decisively in either direction. The sheer scale of this implied geography is part of what makes the meadows worth attending to slowly. In the Greek understanding of the distribution of souls, the meadows were the largest zone of the entire underworld, broader than Elysium, more populated than Tartarus, extending across a gray expanse that no source ever fully maps, because its extent is its defining quality. Most of the dead were there, most of the people who had ever lived across every generation since the first mortals walked the earth, all those nameless men and women who had not performed great deeds or committed great crimes, whose lives had been exactly as large and exactly as small as most lives are. The tradition placed them in the meadows, drifting in the gray-green stillness, the pale stalks of asphodel, standing among them in clusters, the light neither increasing nor decreasing across a plain without horizon. The condition of the shades themselves is something Homer is more specific about than almost any later source, and the specificity is illuminating. In the Odyssey, souls are called psyche, breath souls, and Homer's depiction of them is not, as later tradition sometimes softened it, a depiction of quiet repose. The shades in the meadows flit, they flutter, they move through the underworld with the disorganized, purposeless motion of bats disturbed in a cave, circling and resettling without particular direction. They are weightless, they are insubstantial. They are present in the underworld, but only in the way that a reflection is present in water. The shape is there, the recognizable form, but without the density that made the person once specific and solid and able to act upon the world. A shade in the meadows could not lift a stone, could not move a blade of grass, could not, in Homer's depiction, make itself known to a living visitor without the intermediary of blood, the substance of life poured out, which alone could restore, temporarily and incompletely, something like the capacity for speech and recognition. This is not a minor detail. It is in some ways the central quality of the meadows as Homer imagines them, the reduction of a person to a form that persists without the ability to act, that remembers or does not remember without the ability to do anything with what it knows. The shade retains the shape of the person it was. It retains in most traditions the age and posture and recognizable lineaments of its earthly life, but it cannot touch, cannot be touched, cannot change anything in its surroundings, cannot build or make or refuse with any practical force. It simply is, in the gray light, drifting across the wide plain, and the plain does not change around it and will not change. Then there is the question of the river Lethe. The Lethe, whose name comes from the Greek lethe, meaning concealment or oblivion, flows through the underworld as the river of forgetting, and souls who drink from it lose everything. The tradition is specific about what everything means. Not just the general outline of a life, not merely the name and the city and the broad facts of what someone was. Everything, the faces of people loved for decades, the smell of a particular season, the words of a song sung so many times it had become unconscious, the specific feeling of a morning after grief had lifted and the world had seemed briefly bearable again, the texture of work, the particular quality of being known by someone who had known you for a long time. All of this, in the tradition of the Leah, goes each swallow of the river's cold, still water takes something, and the shade cannot feel it going, because the going is too complete, and when it is finished, the shade is simply standing at the shore of the river with its hands at its sides, and no particular memory of what it was that it has lost, because the loss includes the memory of having had. The geography of the Lethe in the underworld's landscape is not always fixed across ancient sources. Some place it in proximity to the Asphodel Meadows as a threshold that souls cross before arriving in the gray plain. Some describe it as flowing through the meadows themselves, accessible to the shades who drift there across time. What remains consistent across accounts is the function. The Lethe is the mechanism by which the underworld becomes bearable, or perhaps the mechanism by which the question of bearability is removed altogether. A shade that is drunk from the Lethe does not suffer the memory of sunlight, does not grieve for what it cannot touch, does not carry the acute awareness of everything the meadows are not. The oblivion is complete, and in its completeness, calm. This is part of what makes the Orphic tradition's response to the Lethe so striking. Among the graves of ancient Greece, archaeologists have found thin gold tablets, some no larger than a folded leaf, beaten to the thinness of foil, inscribed with instructions for the newly dead. These are the Orphic gold tablets, and the instructions they carry were written for initiates, people who had participated during their lives in Orphic religious traditions, and who were buried with these tablets as a guide for what they would encounter after death. The instructions are specific and practical. When arriving at the underworld, the soul would find two springs, one on the left, one on the right. The soul must not drink from the left, that is the Lethe, the spring of forgetting, but must seek the right-hand spring, which flows from the lake of Mnemosyne, memory, and drink from it. And when challenged by guardians who stand at the water and ask what the soul seeks, the tablets instruct the soul to say, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven. But my race is of heaven. I am parched and dying of thirst. Give me the cold water flowing from the lake of Mnemosyne. The specificity of these instructions is remarkable. These are not metaphorical directions. They were buried with people. They were placed in the hands of the dead, or folded near the mouth, or laid against the chest as a practical guide to navigation. That a religious tradition would develop and transmit these instructions, that people would be buried with texts telling them how to stay themselves through death, speaks to how fully the Greek tradition understood the meadows and the letha as a specific condition to be avoided. If the right preparation had been made, the ordinary dead, arriving without these tablets, without this knowledge, would drink from the letha as a matter of course. They would forget. They would become the flickering, purposeless shades of Homer's meadows, the bats in the cave, the presences that press toward blood, not with intention, but with the reflexive pull of something in them that still recognizes life, without being able to remember why. The Orphic initiate hoped for something else. Not Elysium, necessarily. The Orphic tradition promised the one who successfully navigated the underworld's waters a reunion with the divine, from which the soul had originally descended, a cyclical return that bypassed the gray meadows altogether through the act of remembering. The tablet was a kind of anchor dropped ahead into death, meant to hold the self intact through the crossing. Whether it worked is not something the tradition addresses, because the tradition did not need to. The tablets were the preparation. Their existence was the act of faith. For the shade that arrives without a tablet, which is to say, for most shades, the letha's water is simply there, and the drinking of it is simply what happens. And the gray meadows receive whoever arrives at their edge with an equanimity that does not distinguish between the scholar and the farmer, the singer and the soldier, the person who was loved by many, and the person who went largely unnoticed through their entire earthly life. The meadows receive them. The plain extends. The light holds at its gray neutral pitch. It is Achilles who speaks most directly to what this means. When Odysseus travels to the edge of the world and pours out the blood offering that draws the shades toward him, one of the figures who comes to speak is the shade of Achilles, not the minor shade of someone whose earthly life passed without distinction, but the greatest warrior of his age, the man whose anger had shaped the entire course of the Trojan War, whose grief for Patroclus had moved the narrative of the Iliad to its long devastated center. In the Greek tradition as Homer transmits it, Achilles was given a choice before his birth: a long, peaceful, unremarkable life, or a short life of extraordinary fame. He chose the short life. He chose the glory, and by the measures the tradition provided for glory, the deeds performed, the enemies defeated, the names spoken by men who would never meet him, he had succeeded in what he chose. And yet the shade of Achilles, drinking from the blood trough and speaking with Odysseus across the boundary between the living and the dead, says something that the tradition has held on to for nearly 3,000 years, precisely because of its unambiguous quality. He says that he would rather be alive and laboring for someone else, a living serf, working the land of a man with nothing, a man without property or status, someone at the absolute bottom of the social order that Achilles had sat at the top of, than be lord over all the wasted dead. The word the tradition preserves here matters. The dead are wasted, not peaceful, not resting, not dwelling in a condition that rewards the extraordinary life with appropriate distinction. Wasted, the greatest warrior who had ever lived, a figure who in the meadows should still be recognizable by any shade that had once known the name, was telling a living visitor that he would trade everything: the fame, the name, the mythological weight of what he had been, for the meanest form of living existence imaginable, not for Elysium, not for some better class of afterlife, for a living serf's labor, for the ability to be cold in winter and tired in the evening and subject to someone else's orders, for the ability to feel anything that was real. The shade of Achilles, as Homer describes him, is still recognizable. This is part of the passage's particular quality. He is not diminished into someone unrecognizable. The shape of him is intact, the posture, the presence. He still speaks like Achilles. He still carries himself like someone who was, in life, extraordinary. He asks about his father Peleus and about his son Neoptolemus with the urgency of someone who has not stopped caring about the people he loved. And when Odysseus tells him that Neoptolemus has become a warrior of distinction, the shade of Achilles moves away across the Asphodel Meadows with something that Homer describes as joy, with the long stride of someone whose ghost still knows what it felt like to walk with purpose. The stride of a man going somewhere, even in the gray plain, even after everything the meadows have reduced him to. The shade of Achilles still walks like Achilles walked. This image is worth sitting with slowly, because it is one of the most precise things the Greek tradition offers about what the Asphodel Meadows actually preserve and what they actually take away. The posture remains, the gait remains. The love for a child, specific, named, still active, remains. The rage that had animated the Iliad has quieted, not into peace, but into something more like exhaustion. The stories of his life are all still there in the shade, in some form that cannot be lost because they are too structural to the shape he now takes. The anger, the grief for Patroclus, the particular mourning when he chose to return to battle, knowing what it would cost him. These are not gone. They are the architecture of what he is, but the capacity to do anything with them is gone. The capacity to stand in the sunlight and feel the specific warmth of it on the arms is gone. The capacity to act, to change anything, to move through a world that responds to being moved through. That is the thing the meadows have taken, not the stories, not the love, not the recognizable self, just the weight, just the ability to leave a mark, just the ability to matter in the way that living things matter to each other because they are present in the same air. The shade of Odysseus's mother, Anticlea, offers the other angle on this. When Odysseus reaches the trench and the shades begin to crowd toward the blood, he sees his mother among them, she who had been alive when he left for Troy, who had died. The shade now tells him, not from disease or dramatic cause, but from longing for her son. And Odysseus, whose practical capacity at almost every moment of his long journey is to act, to find the solution, to navigate the impossible. Odysseus tries to embrace her. He moves toward the shade of his mother with his arms open, and the shade does not avoid him or refuse him. It is simply not there in the way that would make an embrace possible. He tries 3 times. 3 times his arms pass through her, through the image of her that the underworld preserves, and the shade passes through the space his arms make, the way smoke moves through air, leaving nothing. The shade of Anticlea explains this to him in terms that Homer puts with extraordinary plainness. This, she says, is simply what happens to mortals when they die. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and bones together. The fire of the funeral pyre consumes all of that. The soul flies away like a dream, fluttering. What remains in the underworld is the image, the shape, the psyche, not the person in the full sense, not the person who could be held. The image of the person persisting in the gray light of the meadows, which is not nothing and is also not what the living mean when they reach for someone they love. This description, the soul like a dream, fluttering, locates the meadows precisely in the register they occupy throughout the oldest Greek sources. Not a horror, not a torture, not even precisely a sorrow, except in the specific sorrow of contact across the boundary, the embrace that the living attempt and the dead cannot fulfill. Within the meadows themselves, among the shades who drift across the wide plain without memory of what they have lost, there is no particular grief, because grief requires the memory of what is absent, and the Letha has made that memory unavailable. The gray plain is quiet. The other shades drift at a distance. The asphodel stands in its pale clusters across the gray-green ground, its tall stalks the only vertical thing in a landscape that otherwise offers no feature for the eye to rest on. The condition of the shades in the meadows is not, in the end, amenable to a simple moral reading. The tradition does not frame it as unjust that the majority of the dead should arrive here and remain here. It does not frame the gray oblivion of the meadows as a failure of the underworld's moral architecture. What the sources that carry this tradition seem most interested in is something more observational than that, the simple, melancholy, quietly astonishing fact that all but the most extreme lives, the most exceptionally virtuous, and the most genuinely wicked, tend toward the same large, gray, wide middle. That the specific texture of a life, the particular quality of its moments, the love that moved through it, the work it was built from, is not the thing the afterlife, in this tradition, principally preserves. That the meadows receive without distinction, that the wide plain does not change to accommodate whoever arrives on it, and does not ask what someone was before they came, and does not offer any horizon to walk toward. The shade of a farmer from ancient Attica, and the shade of a philosopher who argued about the nature of the soul for 40 years, arrive in the same gray light, onto the same wide plain, and the plain does not differentiate between them. One may have drunk from the Lethe, and the other may have drunk from it as well, and both now drift in the same direction, purposeless, quiet existence that the meadows offer everyone who arrives by the middle road. The philosopher's arguments about the soul are not available to the philosopher's shade. The farmer's knowledge of the soil and the seasons is not available to the farmer's shade. What remains is the shape, the posture, the flutter, and, in time, even those grow thinner, more ghost-like, less specific, drifting further from the shore and deeper into the wide meadows where nothing reaches and nothing changes. There is a reading of this that is bleak, and the tradition does not pretend otherwise. Achilles' declaration does not admit of a comfortable interpretation. The shade of Anticlea, passing through her son's arms 3 times in succession, is not a thing the narrative presents as acceptable. Exactly. Homer does not soften these moments with consolation or reframe them within a larger providential order. The dead are there, and they are reduced, and the living cannot reach them, and the meadows are wide and gray and very quiet, and this is how it is. And yet there is another reading available alongside that one, which the meadows also quietly sustain. The shade of Achilles still walks with a long stride. The shade of Anticlea still knows her son when the blood restores her voice. The shade of Achilles still loves Neoptolemus, still asks after him with the particular urgency of a parent asking after a child, and when he hears good news, something that the tradition allows to be called joy moves through the shade of the greatest warrior of his age, and he walks back into the gray plain with a stride that is still recognizably his. What the meadows take is enormous, but the tradition, in its oldest form, is careful not to claim that they take everything. The shape of the person persists. The love for specific people, named people, whose names the shade can still speak, persists in some form. The posture and the gait of a life still lived a particular way persist, built into whatever the shade is made of, at a level that the Lethe's forgetting has not fully reached. The stories are gone, perhaps, the memory of the specific morning, the specific season, the specific face, but the pattern that all those stories made in a person over a lifetime, the particular way they stood and walked and moved through the world, that, in Homer's account, the meadows allow to continue. The shade of Achilles moves back into the gray plain after speaking with Odysseus. The narration does not follow him, it watches him go. The long stride, the stride of someone who was once very alive, who ran faster than any man of his age, who moved through the world with the specific physical confidence of someone who had never been physically defeated, carries him back into the distance, across the wide gray plain, among the other shades who drift in their quieter ways, until the gray light swallows the particular shape of him, and the meadows are simply the meadows again. Wide, still, the asphodel standing in pale clusters across the flat ground, the light not changing, the plain extending without visible edge in every direction. What the shade carries back into that plain is not nothing. The love for a son is still in it. The particular gait is still in it. Something that the tradition calls joy, however diminished, however unable to do anything with itself, in the gray light of the meadows, has moved through that shade just now, because good news about someone it loves was spoken aloud at the edge of the world. This is what persists. Not the name Achilles carried in life. The shade cannot use that name as the living used it, cannot act from it, cannot make it mean anything in the meadows the way it meant something in the world above. But the fact that a particular child is alive and well and fighting with distinction, this has reached the shade of its father across the boundary of blood and firelight and distance, and the shade has responded to it in the way the shade still can, which is to walk back into the wide gray plain with a stride that no one who saw it could mistake for anyone else's. The meadows receive this return with their usual equanimity. The plain does not change, the light does not shift, the other shades drift at their own gentle distances. The asphodel stands. The shade of Achilles moves further and further into the wide gray expanse, the specific weight of him growing thinner in the distance, the stride still visible for a little while, and then not visible, and then the plain is simply the plain, wide and still and gray-green, with no visible boundary and no particular feature, reaching in every direction with the quiet particular endurance of a place that has always received most of the dead, and does not need to announce itself or explain what it is for. Most of the dead are there, most of the people who have ever lived. Across all the generations, the Greek tradition extended back to the earliest men and women, ended in the meadows, the unremarkable and the quietly good, and the people who meant well and fell short and tried again and eventually died in the ordinary way. They are there in the gray light. The plain accommodates them without drama. The asphodel grows among them in its pale clusters. The light holds steady. The wide, open, quiet middle of the underworld goes on in its unhurried way, receiving whoever comes along the middle road, making room in its gray expanse, changing nothing, requiring nothing, holding whatever remains of whoever arrives at its edge, the shape, the stride, the love for a named person, in the only way the meadows know how to hold anything, which is gently and without boundary, and in a light that neither brightens nor dims. Circe stood at the doorway of her hall as the light came up over Aea, her hair loose and her voice unhurried, as though she were describing a route to a neighboring island and not the passage to the country of the dead. She spoke to Odysseus in the plain, specific way that those who know a thing describe it to those who do not, without decoration, without hesitation, without the smallest suggestion that what she was asking him to do was unusual. The world of the dead, in her account, was a place with a shore. It had trees. The approach was a matter of wind and direction, and a particular sequence of acts to be completed in a particular order, and if he followed the sequence correctly, the dead would come. First, she said, the wind. He was to take the north wind behind him when he left Aura and let it carry the ship out across the stream of ocean, that oldest of waters, the river that the Greeks held to circle the entire disk of the world, enclosing everything known within its wide, dark, unhurried current. On the other side of ocean, she told him, he would find a shore of low poplars and willows, the trees sacred to Persephone, the queen of the dead. The shore would be shrouded. The light there would not be the light he was accustomed to. He was not to expect the sun. When he reached that shore, she told him, he was to dig a trench in the ground, a cubit in each direction, and pour his offerings into it, in the order she specified. First a honey mixture, slow and pale, then sweet wine tilted into the earth, then water, plain and cold. Over all of it, a sprinkling of white barley thrown by hand into the hole in the ground, and then, with his own blade, the throats of the animals, a black ram and a black ewe, their blood running dark into the trench, filling it slowly until the smell of it reached whatever country lies beneath the world's floor and drew the dead upward toward the scent of the living. She said he should hold the shades back from the blood with his sword until Tiresias had come and drunk and spoken. The prophet would tell him what he needed to know. The other dead would press and crowd. They would come from everywhere across the meadows the moment the blood reached them, drawn by something older than any intention they might once have had. But he was to keep the blade between himself and the crowd until Tiresias had finished. After that, he could let the others drink in turn. Circe said this, and then she was finished. She turned back into her hall, and Odysseus went down to his crew on the beach, and by midday they had the black animals aboard, and the north wind filling the sail. The stream of ocean is not described by Homer as wild. It is wide and dark and old, but the ship crosses it without difficulty. The wind is steady, the current cooperative, the passage treated in the poem as a matter of half a day's travel rather than as any kind of ordeal. What changes on the crossing is not the sea, but the sky. The light drops and does not return. The sun, which had been low and winter pale over Aea, simply ceases to appear above the horizon, and the world the ship moves through becomes a kind of permanent gray, not night exactly, not the dense black of an overcast night at sea, but a gray that does not vary, that does not deepen or lighten, that is simply the color of everything in the world beyond the river that circles the world. The shore, when it comes, appears out of the fog as a low line of trees. The poplars first, gray-barked and trembling faintly on the bank. Then the willows, their branches trailing over the water, their long leaves pale. The ship grounds in shallow water, and the crew come ashore, and there is no sound from inland, no birds, no wind moving through the trees with anything like the sound that wind makes in living forest, no animal moving in the undergrowth. The only sound is the slow dark water of ocean moving behind them, and ahead nothing. Odysseus digs the trench himself, a cubit in each direction, the soil dark and damp and cold, the cut edges of it clean. He pours the honey mixture first, watching it spread across the floor of the trench in a slow, irregular pool. Then the wine, dark against the pale honey, the smell of it rising in the still air. Then the water, clear and immediate. Then the white barley scattered across the surface by hand, each grain distinct against the dark liquid, for a moment before it settles. The ram and the ewe are cut and held above the trench, and their blood falls into it steadily, darker than the wine, warmer than the ground, and almost immediately the smell changes. It is not just the smell of blood, there is something else underneath it that is harder to name, something that belongs to life in its simplest and most irreducible sense, the blood-warm animal fact of being alive rather than not. And whatever that quality is, it reaches downward through the soil, through whatever distance separates the land of the living from the land of the dead, and something underneath hears it. The first shade that comes is Elpenor. He arrives before Tiresias, before any of the great heroic dead, before anyone Odysseus had expected or prepared himself to see. Elpenor had been one of his crew, not distinguished among them, young and not particularly careful. And on their last morning on Aea, he had slept on the roof of Circe's hall. Too much wine, and the night had been warm, and when he woke in the morning at the sound of the others moving, he had stood up too quickly in the wrong direction and fallen from the roof. The fall killed him. By the time anyone thought to look for him, the ship was already being prepared for departure, and the urgency of Circe's instructions had filled the morning completely. His body was still there, on Aea, unburied. He had not been given the rites. He had not been burned or covered with earth, or sent in any of the forms that the Greeks held were necessary for a soul to properly cross into the country of the dead. He existed, in that sense, in between. His shade had arrived at the underworld's edge without having been formally dispatched there, and this condition meant he had not yet fully crossed, and his shade accordingly appeared at the trench before any of the properly dead could reach it. He recognized Odysseus, and Odysseus recognized him, the face still entirely itself, the expression still the particular expression of Elpenor, still carrying the specific gravity of someone who died badly and suddenly, and has had no time yet to set down the weight of that. He did not come to accuse. He came with a single request, spoken with the directness of someone who has only one thing left to ask and knows it. He asked that when Odysseus returned to Aea, he would find him, find his body still lying where it had fallen from the roof, exposed to the weather and the birds, and burn it with his armor and his oar, and build a grave mound over the ashes on the shore. He asked that his oar be planted on the mound, the oar he had pulled in life, so that those sailing past would know someone was buried there. He said please. He said it plainly, without urgency, in the voice of someone who has moved past urgency and arrived at a simpler kind of needing. Odysseus told him it would be done, and it was, on the return to Aea, before any other thing. Elpenor's body was found and burned, and his oar planted over his ashes on the shore. But that was later. For now, Elpenor faded back from the trench's edge, and Odysseus waited, his sword extended over the blood, keeping the growing crowd of shades from the trench's edge. The shades were coming from across the meadows, in numbers that Homer describes as immense young men and old men, women who had died in childbirth, warriors killed in battle, girls who had not lived long enough to be married, figures from every kind of life, pressing forward through the gray, toward the smell of blood, with the disorganized urgency of a crowd that has no single intention but a shared pull. They were not aggressive in the way of creatures that want to harm. They were drawn, simply, the way something will move toward warmth or light, without knowing it is moving, without deliberation, following an instinct that precedes anything recognizable as thought. Odysseus held his sword horizontal between himself and the crowd. The blade was bronze, and the shades could not touch it, not because it would injure them, but because the living world's bronze held a boundary, simply by existing, simply by being something made and held by a living hand in the living world. The dead crowded at the edge of this line, but did not cross it. They pressed and fluttered. Homer uses the word that bats use, the particular sound of something moving very quickly in a small space, wings or hands or both. the high, thin noise of it, and behind this line of sound and motion, Odysseus waited for the prophet. Tiresias came with his golden staff, which he had carried in life, and which had followed him into death, and he approached the trench with the assurance of someone who had been expected. He had been blind in life, his sight given up to the inner vision that made him the most reliable prophet in the Greek tradition, and in death he retained both his blindness and his knowledge, kept them, Homer implies, specifically because the gods needed someone in the underworld who could still speak useful truths, and Tiresias was the one they had chosen to preserve. He drank from the blood and spoke. He told Odysseus about the cattle of Helios, that they must not be touched, that if they were touched, even one of them, the consequences would be what they were: the ship lost, the crew lost, Odysseus alone surviving to reach home by someone else's vessel. He told him about the suitors. He told him enough. The knowledge was specific and practical and delivered without drama, in the tone of someone providing a map to a person who has asked for one, not reassuring, not threatening, simply accurate. After Odysseus's mother came to drink. Anticlea had been alive when he left for Troy. He had not known she had died. The sight of her shade at the edge of the trench, her face recognizable, her posture recognizable, the particular way she stood that had been her way of standing in life, landed in the poem not as a shock, but as a weight, a specific quiet blow. She drank from the blood, and her eyes cleared, and she saw him. She told him what she knew about home, about his father Lards, living in grief, away from the city, among the farm workers, not eating properly, not sleeping in a proper bed, about Penelope, faithful, holding the household together by effort alone, about Telemachus, managing the estate. She told him she had died of longing for him, not of illness, that the grief of his absence had simply over years run her out. She said this without accusation. She said it as a fact, the way you say a fact that is both true and very difficult, and that has moved past the stage where saying it causes any additional pain. Then Odysseus tried to embrace her. He reached across the edge of the trench and put his arms around his mother, and she was not there, not gone. He could see her. She was directly in front of him, her face exactly as it had always been, but his arms closed on nothing. He tried again, nothing. He tried a third time. His arms went through her without resistance, without any sensation of obstruction, without even the sensation of air being displaced. She was present in every way except the single way that would allow him to hold her, and she simply remained, looking at him while he failed 3 times to take hold of what was standing directly in front of him. She explained it to him plainly, the way she had explained things to him when he was young. The shades, she told him, were not flesh and bone. The sinew no longer held them together. The fire of the funeral pyre had already taken care of that, and what remained was what remained. The soul, the breath shadow, the something that had been the animating quality of a person, and that persisted after the body was no longer there to anchor it. She told him not to grieve for this specifically. She said that this was simply how it was in the world of the dead, that the living did not need to understand it, only to know it. He let her go. She moved back from the trench and faded toward the crowd of shades, and other women came to drink. The great mythological mothers and queens, Tyro and Alcmene and Epicast, and the others, each arriving in turn, each carrying the specific gravity of her own story, drinking from the blood and becoming briefly capable of speech and recognition, and then stepping back as the next shade pressed forward. The heroes came later. Agamemnon was there, the commander of the Greek forces at Troy. his shade still carrying the particular weight of a man who had returned home after 10 years of war and been killed in his bath by his wife and her lover on the day of his arrival. He spoke about treachery and about trusting no woman, a declaration that Odysseus received without comment, and that Homer seems to allow Agamemnon's bitterness without endorsing. The shade has a right to its anger in the way that the very recently dead have a right to the specific emotions of their death, still fresh, still unprocessed, still more wound than scar. Then Achilles came, and this was different. Achilles had been the greatest of the Greek warriors, the swiftest, the most devastating in the field, the figure around whose rage the Iliad's entire architecture turns. He had chosen his fate knowingly, a short life with glory rather than a long life with none. He had chosen Troy, and he had died there as the tradition held he would, his heel the one place his divine mother's hand had not made invulnerable, when she dipped him as an infant in the river Styx, and an arrow, Apollo's, or guided by Apollo, found exactly that place in the last year of the war. He came to the trench and drank, and recognized Odysseus, and asked about his son Neoptolemus, who was still alive, and here the shade of Achilles showed something that was recognizably pride. The father's impulse to know how the child turned out, even from death, even without any ability to intervene or change anything. Odysseus told him Neoptolemus had fought at Troy, had been brave, had comported himself exactly as his father's son. At this, the shade of Achilles moved across the meadow with what Homer describes as a long stride, the gait of someone who is pleased, and this detail stays in the poem, stays in the reader, because it is such an ordinary human thing, a dead man pleased by the news of his son. But Odysseus had praised Achilles. He had said, meaning it, or meaning to comfort, that among the dead Achilles was the greatest, that nothing in death should be cause for grief for someone of his stature, that he ruled here over the dead as a kind of king. And it was in response to this that Achilles said what he said, the declaration that sits at the center of Homer's understanding of what it meant to be dead and what it meant to be alive, stripped of every consolation and every false comfort. He said, "Do not try to reconcile me to death." He said he would rather be a living serf, bound to the worst kind of labor, owning nothing, landless, working for a man who himself owned nothing, at the very lowest rung of the living world, than to be lord over all the wasted dead, not the greatest dead, not honored and powerful among the dead. He would rather be the least of the living. This is the Asphodel Meadows from the inside, not described from outside as a gray, open, indifferent plain, but spoken from within it by the shade that had the best possible case for contentment there, by the shade that had chosen short life and glory and gotten the glory, and now found himself in possession of it, in a country where glory has no function, where the stories of a life are present, but the capacity to live inside them is permanently and entirely gone. Achilles in the meadows was not punished. He was not suffering in the way that the condemned in Tartarus suffered. He was simply there, in the gray open plain, with all of himself intact and nothing for any of it to press against. He turned and walked back into the meadows after this, the long stride still his, the posture still the warrior's posture, the shade still carrying in its movement everything that the living Achilles had been, and that was the last Odysseus saw of him, the shade of the greatest warrior moving away across gray ground, without urgency, without destination, without any particular orientation toward anything at all, simply back into the field of shades from which he had come. Ajax was there, farther out in the meadows, standing at a distance, and Odysseus called to him. Ajax was the second greatest of the Greek warriors at Troy, enormous, steadfast, the one who had held the line alone when everything else was failing. He had lost his mind after Achilles' death, not to grief exactly, but to the judgment that followed the death, the vote among the Greek commanders over who should inherit Achilles' famous armor, the armor made by Hephaestus at Thetis's request, divine work and beautiful beyond anything mortal hands could make. The vote went to Odysseus. Ajax, who had fought harder, who had the stronger physical claim by every visible measure, lost the vote to the cleverness and the words of the smaller man. He killed himself. He had been the kind of man for whom a loss of that specific kind, a loss of honor, a public verdict that his judgment and worth were inferior, was not survivable, not because he was weak, but because the entire structure of his existence had been built on a principle that the vote directly contradicted. He killed himself, and he died still inside the anger, and in the underworld the anger was still there, unchanged, because nothing had happened after death to change it. The meadows do not resolve things, they preserve them. Odysseus spoke to Ajax's shade across the gray air of the meadows, appealing to him, acknowledging that the judgment had caused harm, asking him to step forward and speak, saying that even in death there might be something to say to one another, some word that could serve as the beginning of whatever follows a wrong that cannot be undone. Ajax turned away, his shade still enormous, still carrying the full physical scale and posture of the man he had been, turned away from Odysseus and walked back into the gray of the meadows without a single word. The silence of Ajax is one of Homer's most controlled pieces of characterization. The shade says nothing, but the shade says nothing in a completely specific, completely legible way. The anger is total. The refusal is total. The figure moving away from Odysseus and back into the gray of the Asphodel Meadows, without speech, carries more weight than any of the speeches the poem has given him, because the silence is itself a declaration, and because the particular silence of a man who has decided that there are no words adequate to what was done to him, and that therefore none will be offered, is very different from the silence of someone who has nothing to say. He disappeared into the gray of the meadows. The gray took him back, and he was simply part of the wide, flat, indifferent country again, one shade among the many drifting without orientation across the open plain. And Odysseus watched him go. There were others. Minos was visible at a remove, seated with his golden scepter, the dead pressing around him in dispute. Orion was there, still hunting across the meadows as he had hunted in life, pursuing the same animals through the gray asphodel that he had pursued through living mountain and forest, the animals of the underworld, whatever those were, scattering before his enormous shade across the gray plain, the whole scene carrying the particular quality of a habit, continued past any context that gives it meaning, the shade of a hunter, still hunting because hunting was what he was, the motion persisting after everything that once motivated it has dissolved. Sisyphus was visible, working. He was pushing his great stone up a slope that existed somewhere at the margin of the meadows, some incline near the edge of Tartarus, where the light of the Phlegethon River still reached as a faint orange red at the very limit of vision, and the stone would go almost to the top and then come back. And Sisyphus would go back to the bottom and begin again. He had been there for a very long time. The rock had been perfectly smooth for years. Tantalus stood in water that retreated when he bent to drink, beneath fruit-laden branches that rose beyond his reach when he reached for them, the form of plenty made permanently, exquisitely unavailable, the exact shape of the thing he had done in life, given back to him as the permanent condition of his existence. These were the condemned, but they were distant, and the meadows themselves were not this. The meadows were the wide gray middle country between the depths and the heights, the indifferent plain where most of the dead simply were, without punishment, without reward, without much of anything that the living world would recognize as the content of a life. Odysseus saw Heracles too, or rather, he saw the image of Heracles, the shade of him, the eidolon, while the real Heracles, if such a thing could be said to exist, was on Olympus among the gods, having been granted immortality at his death in recognition of his labors. The shade that moved through the meadows was what the underworld held in lieu of the actual Heracles, the shape and gait of the man, carrying a golden sword belt across its chest, the belt decorated with images of the violence of his life, bears and lions and boars and battles, all of it rendered in the gold with the skill of the finest craftsman, and the shade itself still moving with the particular motion of someone who had never in any moment of his existence been anything other than ready for whatever came next. At some point, the crowd of shades became too many, and the press of them too urgent, the crowding of the meadows dead, too dense against the blood trench and the sword, and Odysseus felt something, not fear exactly, but the awareness of someone who has been somewhere longer than they should stay, and he moved back toward the ship. The crew was ready, the black animals were gone, their blood already given, the trench was still there, in the low foggy ground, among the poplars and willows, but already it had the quality of something that was finished, a hole dug for a specific purpose, and now complete, the purpose accomplished. The ship left the shore of the dead at the same tide that had brought it in. Ocean's current, broad and steady behind the hull, the fog-bound shore receding in the mist. The poplars disappeared first, their pale trunks fading into the gray of the fog until there was no shore visible, only the gray water ahead and the gray sky above and the gray mist behind, closing over the place they had been as though no gap had opened there, as though no trench had been dug in the ground among those willows, as though no blood had been poured and no dead had crowded forward out of the wide gray plain of the meadows toward the smell of the living. The stream of ocean crossed itself again in the other direction as the ship made passage back toward the known world. The sun appeared before they reached Aegea, first as a lightning in the sky to the east, then as a pale disk, then as something actual and warm, casting shadows from the rigging across the deck, and the crew felt it on their faces, and some of them stood in it for a moment, simply to feel it, the way people stand in warmth after having been cold for a time. Back on Aegea, as Circe had made him promise, and as Elpenor had made him promise, and as every obligation of the living toward the dead required, Odysseus found the body where it had fallen, still on the roof, still in the attitude of sudden collapse. They brought him down. They burned him with his armor, and when the fire had done what fire does, they built the mound over the ash and planted his oar in the earth above it, pointing upward into the sky, a grave marker in the shape of the object by which he had been known, the oar of a rower who had pulled across the same water his captain had pulled across, and been given nothing from death that his captain had been given from life, but who had been found and burned and marked and not forgotten. The mound sat on the shore of Aegea, the oar upright above it, the sea visible from where it stood, the sound of water audible in the morning when the wind was in the right direction. The shore of Aegea was not the shore of the dead. The sun reached it every day without fail. Whatever Elpenor was, whatever persisted of him in whatever country received such things, the grave was there, and it was enough, and it had been done. The stream of ocean continued its slow, wide circuit of the world. On the other side of it, The fog still wrapped the land of the Cimmerians and the shore of poplars and willows, the sun still not cresting above it. The trench in the ground, still a cubit in each direction, emptied now of everything that had been poured into it. The soil around it darkened. The shades had gone back to the meadows. The great wide plain had taken them back, quiet and gray and indifferent, the asphodel standing in its pale clusters across the open ground without boundary or feature, the sound of the underworld's rivers faint from wherever the rivers ran. Ajax was back in the meadows. Achilles was back in the meadows. Anticlea was there, and Elpenor's shade, properly arrived now that his body had been burned, and the unnamed hundreds and thousands of ordinary dead, pressing no particular claim and going no particular direction across the gray-green ground. The ship that had been there was gone. The blood in the trench had soaked into the earth. The poplars at the shore of ocean stood very still in the absence of wind, their leaves barely moving, and the fog beyond them did not thin or shift or resolve into any other kind of light. It remained exactly as it had been, gray and wide and quiet, the whole enormous country of the dead continuing its gray, unhurried existence on the other side of the water, as it had continued before Odysseus arrived, and as it would continue long after the story of his visit. There had passed through every mouth that would ever tell it, and come to rest, finally, in the dark, at the edge of the meadow where three roads meet. The gray light holds everything equally. A soul stands at this crossroads and takes in what can be taken in. The ground beneath is neither soft nor hard, packed earth of some kind, pale and dry, the same pale gray color as the sky overhead, that is not a sky, the same pale gray color as the flat open land stretching behind in every direction. Three roads branch outward from this point. One of them curves upward very slightly, so gradually that the eye is not sure it rises at all, and something about the air above it is marginally less flat than the air above the others. One descends, also gently, into a darkness that is not dramatic, simply a darkening, a place where the gray deepens by degrees, and the road continues down into it. And the third road goes straight ahead into the open plain that stretches out without feature toward a horizon the eye cannot locate. Most of the souls waiting at the crossroads meadow stand facing that third road. They stand quietly, without pressing or crowding, because there is no urgency here, and the thing they wait for is patient enough to take as long as it requires. Near the center of the meadow, on a throne of gold that catches no light but seems nevertheless to be the brightest point within the gray, a figure sits with a scepter across his knees. The scepter is also gold. The figure is still and patient, and the shades of the dead approach him one at a time and speak in low voices that do not carry far in the gray air, and he listens. This is Minos. In Homer's account, he is seated exactly this way. The golden throne, the golden scepter, the crowd of the dead arranged around him, their disputes quiet and ongoing in the gray light, while he hears them and judges. During his life on the island of Crete, he was understood to have been among the most just of all kings, a ruler appointed by Zeus himself, governing with a fairness that the tradition remembered long after his reign had ended, long after Crete was only an island and not the center of a world. That record of earthly justice was why he was sent here, after his death, to administer the same quality of attention to every soul that arrived at the crossroads, one at a time, without end. He was the son of Zeus and Europa, which placed him within the tradition of figures shaped equally by the divine and the mortal, inheriting the long sight of his father and the mortality of his mother, carrying both into a life that was bounded and into a death that was not. Rhadamanthus shared the same parentage, the same father and the same mother, and had served as a judge equally famed for his uprightness before his own death brought him here to take up the work alongside Minos. Aeacus was also a son of Zeus, though his mother was Aegina, the sea nymph whose name became the island, and he had governed so wisely during his earthly life that even foreign peoples had called on him to adjudicate their disputes, and his reputation for fairness had moved with him unchanged through death into the work he now performed among the shades of Europe, hearing each case as it arrived and deciding it without distortion. Plato's account in the Gorgias divides the work clearly. Rhadamanthus presides over the souls arriving from Asia, Aeacus presides over the souls arriving from Europe, and Minos holds the golden scepter and the casting vote for the cases that neither of the others can resolve alone, the difficult ones, the ambiguous ones, the lives that do not resolve neatly into the categories that tradition provides. The arrangement is practical. It distributes the work across the full scale of the dead, which is a very considerable scale indeed, and ensures that no soul waits longer than necessary, and no judge grows so accustomed to a particular kind of life that he stops seeing clearly. The crossroads meadow itself carries a significance that extends beyond the judgment seat. 3 roads converging at one point is an image that the Greek tradition associated specifically with Hecate, goddess of the liminal, goddess of the spaces between things, whose roadside shrines stood at crossroads throughout the living world and received offerings from those who wished to honor the dead or navigate uncertain passages. At every 3-way crossing in the upper world, the tradition placed a small shrine, and the living left food, small figures, and torches there for the goddess and for the dead who had not quite finished their crossing. That the judgment of all souls took place at exactly this kind of 3-road meeting point connected the formal legal process of the afterlife to something older and quieter, the way the living had always understood intersections as places where what was normally separate could briefly meet. The soul at the crossroads waits its turn. From where it stands, the 3rd road, the one that continues straight ahead into the flat gray-green plain, is the widest of the 3. It is also the most worn. The surface of it has the appearance of a path that has received an enormous amount of traffic over a very long time, not from any single era of crowding, but from the slow, continuous passage of the great majority of human souls across whatever time means in a place where time works differently. That worn look is not dramatic. It is simply the look of the most used road, the one that most travelers end up on, not because it was chosen over the others in a considered way, but because it is where the majority of lives tend to lead. Plato describes the judgment process with a precision that has the quality of someone who has thought carefully about what justice actually requires. In the Gorgias, Zeus is presented as explaining to Hermes what has gone wrong with the previous arrangement, in which souls were judged while still wrapped in their bodies, in their fine clothing, accompanied by their reputations, surrounded by the wealth and appearance and social position they had accumulated during their earthly lives. The problem with that arrangement, in Plato's telling, was that the outer layer of a person's life obscured what was actually inside it. A beautiful body could distract the judge from a misshapen soul. A reputation for generosity built through strategic public gifts could screen a private history of cruelty. The trappings of a well-lived life, assembled for display, could function as a kind of noise through which the actual signal of that life was difficult to read. So Zeus changed the arrangement. From Plato's account, souls are stripped of their bodies entirely before appearing before the judges, appearing, as it were, as only themselves, without the physical container that had been the instrument of all their choices and the visible evidence of their social standing. The marks of their actions are still present, but now they are interior marks, legible only from the inside. The judge leans forward slightly in the gray light and reads the soul directly, the way one might read the grain of a piece of wood or the lines of a face seen close, looking for what the life actually was, underneath every layer that had been placed over it. And the soul that had been sentenced unjustly in life because its accuser was powerful and its defenses were poor stands before this court with no disadvantage, its actual quality visible. The distortions of earthly injustice available to be corrected here, where wealth and reputation have been left behind with the body. That corrective quality is something Virgil also preserves in his account. In the Aeneid, Minos shakes his urn, the urn that summons souls to the judgment, and calls the assembly of the silent to hear the cases of those condemned under false accusation during their lives. The phrasing is specific, those condemned under false accusation. The court at the Crossroads Meadow is not only a place where correct judgments are made for the first time, it is also a place where incorrect ones, made in the upper world, can be quietly, permanently undone, where the person whose reputation was destroyed by a lie, whose conviction rested on fabricated evidence, whose guilt was assumed because they were poor, or foreign, or inconveniently placed, can be examined without the lie and found to be something entirely different from what the earthly record said. Minos on his golden throne hears all of this. The scepter across his knees is the same kind of scepter that runs through the Homeric lineage of divinely authorized kingship, the same line of objects tracing back through Agamemnon to Zeus himself, forged by Hephaestus and passed through Hermes, and down through mortal hands across the generations. A scepter in that tradition is not just a symbol of authority, it is a physical record of the authority it has passed through, a held thing, a sign that what is happening here is continuous with what happened in the upper world, and not separate from it, the same justice, carried downward into the dark and administered here in the gray light with the same quality of attention the gods expected when they first made it available to human kings. The shade that waits in the Crossroads Meadow is at this point almost nothing, not in a way that causes distress, simply in the way that the middle stage of anything is not the beginning or the end, but the quiet passage between them. The gray-green plain stretches behind it. The three roads branch ahead. The soul has no body and no memory of warmth, and no current relationship to the things that made its life feel particular and its own, but its record is intact. What it did is present in it, fully, in the way the grain is present in wood, not displayed but real, and visible to the kind of attention that knows how to look. Asicus at his station is patient in the way that someone can be patient who has never been in a hurry, because hurrying does not help, and the work is the same regardless of pace. The line of souls from Europe extends back across the plain in the gray light, each shade at a quiet distance from the next, the line neither urgent nor sluggish. Each soul arrives at the head of the line and is heard. The hearing takes what it takes. Some lives are short, and their records correspondingly sparse. Some lives are long and tangled and full of reversals and contradictions, and the kinds of actions that look different depending on which way you hold them to the light. Aphiacus hears all of them with the same unhurried quality he brought to the disputes that neighboring peoples brought to him when he was alive on the island that bore his mother's name, and the decisions he made then carried the same quality he applies here, the specific gravity of someone who takes seriously that what they decide will not be easily undone. The road to Elysium, curving slightly upward to the right, is narrow in comparison to the middle road, not dramatically narrow, not a thread, not a difficult path requiring effort to stay on, simply less worn. The traffic it receives is real and visible in the packed surface, but it is a smaller proportion of the total. The lives that arrive at the crossroads and are sent along that road are the lives that earned it, lives of exceptional virtue, of philosophical dedication to truth in Plato's framing, of heroic achievement in Homer's, of genuine goodness so sustained and consistent that no other road would be accurate. Those lives are not common, and the narrowness of the road reflects that accurately without making any comment on it. The road is exactly as wide as it needs to be. The road that descends to the left, into the deepening dark, receives a smaller proportion still. Tartarus, at the end of that road, at the bottom of a fall so long it would take 9 days for a dropped anvil to complete, is for the lives that earned it, and those too are not common. Most people who have ever lived have not done what it takes to end up at the far end of either of those roads. Most people have lived the lives that most people live, mixed, partial, neither exceptional nor condemnable, full of ordinary failures and ordinary kindnesses and ordinary days that do not resolve into any pattern that would distinguish them from the mass of lives on either side. Those are the lives that come to rest in the Asphodel Meadows, and those lives constitute the overwhelming majority of all the lives that have ever been. The flat, wide, worn road, stretching straight ahead into the plain, is their road. And it is, in the most straightforward sense, the road that determines the character of the underworld. The meadows are the underworld in the way that a country is defined by its most common landscape, not by its mountains, which are more striking, or by its sea, which has more drama, but by the enormous, quiet, ordinary middle that most of it consists of, the part that most people live in and most travelers pass through, and most accounts of the country, in dwelling on its notable features, tend to skip over. There is a particular quality to the gray light that holds the crossroads meadow, not the darkness of a starless night, or the dim of a room with a small window, but something else, a light that is simply the light available here, which has always been this amount, and no more and no less. It does not change across the meadows. There is no part of the plain that receives more of it, and no part that is more shadowed. It is in its own way an equal light, the same for the shade that arrived yesterday and the shade that arrived 1,000 years ago, the same for the souls waiting at the crossroads, and the souls already dispersed into the gray-green plain beyond it. The asphodel grows here too. It grows in the meadows as it grows on the limestone hillsides of the upper world, in dense pale clusters, the stalks tall and upright, and the flowers open at the top of each one, the 6 white petals arranged around the center in the shape that anyone who has ever seen an asphodel in flower would recognize immediately. The flowers hold their white with the same quality down here as they hold it on a hillside in late spring under full sun, a whiteness that is almost blue when the light is strong, almost gray when it is flat, depending on the angle. Down here the light is always flat. Down here the flowers are a gray-white that is still, unmistakably white. Each petal carries the brownish-pink stripe along its center, running from the base to the tip. It is the detail that only becomes visible up close when the flower is held in the hand or leaned over in the field. From a distance, the asphodel appears to be simply white, a plain and practical white, the kind that requires no particular admiration and demands nothing. But up close the stripe is there, a faint warmth at the heart of something that from a distance seemed entirely without warmth. The plant holds that detail quietly without offering it. It is only available to the attention that gets close enough to see it. In the upper world, the asphodel grew on the hillside graves and sent its roots down through the soil toward the body below. The logic of that planting was practical and philosophical at once. The large underground tubers could serve as sustenance for the dead in whatever form the dead still required sustenance, and the white flowers blooming above the grave marked the place with something living, something that would return each season, something that connected the body underground to the light and air and seasonal rhythm it had once moved through without thinking. The plant was planted on graves because the two worlds it connected, the one above the soil and the one below it, were, in the Greek understanding, not as far apart as the living tended to assume. The roots went down, the flowers came up. The plant went about its work in both directions without making much of it. Here in the meadows, the same logic holds. The asphodel grows in its pale clusters among the shades of the ordinary dead, tall and persistent, its roots going down into whatever is below the meadows, and its flowers opening upward into the flat gray light. The plant does not flower for any particular reason in the upper world. It flowers because that is what it does, when the season comes and the conditions are met. Down here, where seasons do not arrive in the same way, it flowers anyway, with the indifference of something that has its own internal cycle and does not require confirmation from the world around it in order to keep going. The soul at the crossroads waits as Achis works through the line. There is no impatience. Impatience requires a different relationship to time. The sense of time passing while something wanted is withheld, the gap between the current moment and the preferred one. Here, there is no preferred moment toward which the wait is oriented. There is simply the gray-green plain and the faint golden point of the scepter at the center of the meadow, and the three roads branching in their three directions, and the sound of quiet voices at the judgment seat, and the asphodel standing in its pale clusters at the edge of the meadow where the plain begins. When the turn comes, the soul approaches the judge. It has no face in the way it had a face in life, no particular expression, no skin that carries the history of weather and grief and joy that the actual face carries over a long life, no eyes with the specific color and depth that allowed the people who loved it to know it immediately from a distance in a crowd. It is in Plato's framing, stripped down to what it actually is, which is also what it always was, underneath the face and the clothing and the body and the reputation, the pattern of its choices, legible at last without any of the things that made those choices difficult to read while they were being made. The judge leans forward slightly. This is not a theatrical gesture. It is the physical habit of someone who is used to looking carefully. The same slight lean that a reader makes toward a page when the light is not quite enough. The same lean that a craftsperson makes toward fine work held in the hands. The soul's record is present in it, in the way that the grain is present in wood, before the wood is cut, there complete, the full history of what the tree was, and how it grew, even when the surface shows nothing of it. Minos listens with his scepter across his knees, not performing authority, but embodying it in the way that anyone embodies a quality that has been genuinely theirs long enough that they no longer have to think about maintaining it. The authority is simply there, in the quality of his attention, in the patience with which each case is heard before the verdict comes. Some verdicts are immediate. The soul arrives, and its record is plain, and the road it is sent down is clear to any eye that looks. Some take longer, the disputed cases, the ambiguous ones, the lives that contain within them such a mixture of the good and the ordinary and the genuinely failed that the record seems to argue with itself. Those are heard fully before a word is said, and Minos holds the final word for any case that the other two judges cannot bring to agreement. The soul receives its verdict quietly. It is sent along its road, or it is already standing on it, the middle road, wide and worn, and continuing straight ahead into the flat gray-green plain that stretches without visible boundary in that direction. There is no drama in the sending. The soul moves along the road, and the road continues, and the plain opens around it, and behind it the crossroads meadow recedes, the golden gleam of the scepter diminishing slowly until the flat gray light absorbs it, and the plain is simply the plain again, wide and still, and full of the quiet, unhurried presence of the great majority of the dead, going about the particular form of existence that the meadows hold. The road continues. The asphodel stands in its clusters on either side. The flowers are open, their 6 white petals pale in the gray light, the brownish-pink stripe along the center of each one available to any shade that pauses close enough to look. Most of the shades do not pause to look. They move through the meadows with the drift of things that have lost the urgency that drives the living, that have also lost the direction that urgency provided, and now move without either through the wide gray-green plain among the other shades that drift the same way, in a stillness that is not troubled and not comfortable, because it is not the kind of stillness that has a relationship to comfort or its absence anymore. The world here is old. The tradition that holds it is older than any text that records it, older than the tablets the Orphics inscribed and placed in graves, older than Homer sitting wherever Homer sat, and finding the words for what Odysseus found at the edge of the world, older than the philosophers who took that world and tried to reason out its logic. The crossroads meadow, with its 3 roads and its patient judges, is a structure that the Greek imagination built across centuries, adding and refining and questioning and revising. And what has survived into the form that arrived in writing is the product of all of that, a system for thinking about what the dead deserve, and how justice can survive the fact that the living world administers it so poorly. Minos on his throne embodies that long thought. His golden scepter, forged by Hephaestus, and carrying in its lineage the full weight of divinely authorized judgment, is a thread connecting the underworld court to the courts of kings in the upper world, the same instrument, the same authority, the same principle that fairness is something the world is obligated to provide, and that when the living world fails to provide it, somewhere else must. The golden throne in the gray light of the Asphodel Meadows is the afterlife of that principle, as much as it is the afterlife of the king who holds it. Rhadamanthus, at his station hearing the souls of Asia, is not hurrying. Aeacus, at his station hearing the souls of Europe, is not hurrying. The line extending back across the meadows from Aeacus's station is simply the line that forms naturally when there are more cases than a single moment can contain, and the cases are heard in their order, and the order holds. There is, in that patience, something that the upper world's courts rarely manage, the patience of a process that is not running against time, that does not have a closing hour, or a cue that must be finished before the light fails. The light here does not fail. It is always exactly this amount of light, and the work goes on. The soul that has been sent along the middle road is moving now through the meadows proper. The crossroads is behind it. The other souls it passes are at that quiet, drifting distance from each other that the meadows have always maintained, close enough to sense the presence of others, not close enough to engage with them in any of the ways that required a body and a voice and a shared investment in the outcome. They move, they drift, they exist in the particular way that the meadows permit, which is a diminished way, and also the way that the tradition held was simply what existence looked like for the vast majority of the dead. Not punishment, not reward, but the neutral condition of having been ordinary in the deepest sense of that word. Occasionally, among the shades of the meadows, there are figures that the tradition named. Achilles is here, not because his life was ordinary, but because the tradition placed him here after his death, before Odysseus arrived to speak with him, and his shade carries the full posture of the warrior, even in this diminished place, the long stride of someone who was once very alive, the set of the shoulders that carry the memory of a particular way of moving through the world, even after the world that required that movement is gone. The heroes of the tradition pass through the meadows in the same gray light as everyone else, because death is not impressed by heroism in the way that life is, and the meadows do not sort their inhabitants by fame. The asphodel that stands at the edge of the middle road has been standing there as long as the meadows have been the meadows. The plant does not know this. The plant does not know anything in the way that a plant does not know things, but it persists, because persistence is the deepest quality of the asphodel, the characteristic that defines it as clearly as its flowers define its appearance. It grew on the rocky hillsides where more desirable plants had been grazed to nothing. It grew on the graves where the dead lay. It grows here, in the gray light of the largest zone of the underworld, in its pale clusters, its roots in the gray earth, and its flowers open toward whatever passes, for up in a place that is already below everything. The brownish-pink stripe on each petal is still there. It is the detail that requires proximity, the warmth that is not visible from a distance, available only to the attention that comes close. In the meadows, most attention does not come that close to anything. The shades drift. The plain continues. The crossroads meadow is behind, and the judgment at its center is continuing its unhurried work, and the three roads branch outward toward their three destinations, and the widest and most worn of them leads here, into the gray-green quiet that has always held the majority of the dead. The judges do not rest. This is not because they are prevented from resting, but because the work does not stop arriving, and they were sent here to do it, and they do it with the quality that made them worthy of the appointment, steady, patient, without vanity or impatience, or the specific failures of judgment that earthly courts were prone to. Minos holds his golden scepter and listens, hears the souls of Asia with the focused attention of someone who has been thinking about fairness for longer than any living person has been alive. Aeacus hears the souls of Europe with the same quality he brought to the disputes of neighboring peoples when he was alive on his island, and the decisions he makes here carry the same patient accuracy. The meadow where the three roads meet is, in the end, a quiet place.